If you look at Pomerania today, you'll see that it's divided between Poland and Germany, with Poles and Germans dominating their respective regions, the respective parts of Pomerania, with of course the native Kashubians still living in Pomerania, and some chiefly Ukrainian but also Russian and Belarusian refugees sprinkled throughout, as well as other insignificant minorities, mainly in the larger cities. Personally, in Gdańsk, where I live, other than the ethnic groups I've mentioned, I've seen some Nigerians, I've seen some Chinese, I've seen some Indians. Gdańsk is quite a multicultural city, and it was pretty much always so, historically. And so was the rest of Pomerania, maybe to a lesser extent than Gdańsk itself, but it was still in a very interesting position ethnographically. Today we'll be taking a look at that. The history of Pomerania, as it concerns us, begins with when the region was settled by the Slavs in the 5th and 6th centuries of our era, common era, of course. Of those that concern us the most, the group that settled between the Oder and the Elbe were the Polabians. Of course, Vorpommern or Pomerania is a part of Pomerania that here we've got Vorpommern. It's flipped because I'm recording it in portrait view. But you know, imagine it's flipped. This is Vorpommern. And of course, this is the Oder, and the Elbe is somewhere there. So the Polabians lived there. Of course, now they're German, they were Germanized. And we'll be taking a look at how that came to be as well, of course. Don't doubt me. You'll be knowing everything. And of course, east of the Oder were the Pomeranians, well, Kashubians. We don't know exactly what the etymology of the word Kashubian is. There are some theories. One says that it's related to the name of the city of Quelbrzeg. Another is it's connected to some word for like jackets, like fur jackets, which Pomeranians used to wear apparently. And another is that it's connected to a word for bushes. We don't know. Despite what some may claim or assume, though, Kashubians are most definitely not Poles. Even though they are closely related, the Kashubian language doesn't stem from Old Polish. It's a separate branch. The Pomeranian branch is separate from the Polish branch. So Poland never had enough control over the area to fully assimilate it into the Polish identity either, before the 20th century, of course. Fully is key here, because they did have some success in doing so, namely in the south, where the Kociewian and Borowian cultures evolved from the Kashubians. They speak a dialect of Greater Polish that is greatly influenced by Kashubian. There was also Polish settlement in Pomerania after the Teutonic defeat, but it only really started to grow on a larger scale in the 19th century, when Poles from the Russian Empire started to look for better places to have a job and to live. Of course, Prussia was a richer, more industrialized country, so they looked to settle there. And of course, Pomerania has sometimes ties with Poland historically, and is the closest. So that's where they usually ended up. Of course, some ended up in the Ruhr area, in the Rhineland. There were also quite a bunch of Poles there, but that doesn't concern us today. Then in the 20th century, of course, the immigration really started to become even wider, because Poland became independent. and it gained access to the sea through Pomerania, through the Polish corridor. And Poland had a policy of appointing local governments from above, it wasn't, they weren't democratically elected from the people that lived there. They were chosen from whoever the government liked personally. So that sucked. And also those people who were chosen didn't really have a lot of respect for the local populace or the local culture. And that's kind of where the discrimination against the Kashubians really started to begin. And of course, Poland built the city of Gdynia, north of Gdańsk. So that really amplified the immigration a lot. That was a huge factor. And then obviously after the war, all the Germans, and not only the Germans actually, it sucks that they deported people based on their ethnicity in the first place, but other ethnicities that weren't Germans but also weren't Slavic also took the punch. So, but in their place, Poles settled the area. Number one, there were Poles who repatriated from abroad, for example from France, where there was a lot of Polish emigration in the 19th century. Hence why there is a sizable amount of French people in Western Pomerania, because obviously Hinterpommern was dominated by Germans, so that's where most of the population went, and Gdańsk, right, when it comes to Pomerania. Some settled from Poland proper, like from, Greater Poland, Mazovia. 3, some were deported from the east, mainly from Lithuania and Belarus, hence why there is a lot of people in Pomerania today with Lithuanian and Belarusian last names and speaking the northern borderlands dialect of Standard Polish influenced by it. In fact, I would bet that most people living in Western Pomerania today are probably from Belarus or Lithuania. Now, like never before, the city of Gdańsk as well as Hinterpommern became Polish. There was also immigration into Kashubia, but on a smaller scale, and there the conversion into Polishness happened through forceful assimilation due to policies employed by the Polish government, now discriminating Kashubians on a full scale. And that resulted in decimating the number of Kashubian speakers to the point that only about 80,000 people speak it today. Other groups that have immigrated to Pomerania in the recent past to a significant degree are the Vietnamese, because of the Eastern Bloc student exchange programs in the 1950s and 60s. While most of those who ended up staying did so in Warsaw, some also did, for example, in the Pomeranian Tri-City or in Szczecin. So there are some Vietnamese in Pomerania. But let us look at how the region's ethnic makeup looked further in the past. Let's start from the beginning, even before the Slavic settlement and throughout its first couple of centuries. North Germanic emporia were set up in Pomerania, most notably in Wolin, in Ostsiedlung, which, fun fact, gets its name from the Norse equivalent of Oxhead. Oxhead, you can see the resemblance. And the semi-legendary Jomsborg, inhabited by Joms Vikings. These emporia lost their significance in the 11th century and eventually disappeared in the 11th to 12th centuries. Denmark and Sweden would also expand into Pomerania later, but that didn't really have an effect or an impact on the ethnic makeup on the region. One really important concept in the history of Pomerania is the Ostsiedlung, the German settlement of the East. I told you we'd mention that. In Pomerania, it coincided with the Duchy of Pomerania joining the Holy Roman Empire after getting free from Denmark. The Pomeranian dukes welcomed the influx of German settlers with open arms, the country gaining more population because before that it was really sparsely populated. And that meant more workforce, and the German noble families had way more renown than the Kashubian noble families, so the German culture and language was also a lot of more prestigious, and the local population, because of all of that, had a lot of incentive to adopt German culture. At about the same time, we're talking the 12th, 14th centuries, the Hanseatic League formed and expanded its influence into many of the coastal cities and towns of Pomerania. The primary language of communication between the merchants of the Hansa was Low German, and so the bearers of Pomerania rather quickly adopted Low German customs and language. It got to the point where the Kashubians were discriminated against in many such cases. For example, in the 16th century, Kolberg, their rights in trade and crafts were limited, with bandsmen performing certain types of professions and taking certain positions in the city, and in 1564 it was forbidden to admit native Slavs to the blacksmiths. So either adopt the German culture or go fuck yourself. Another thing that also happened at the same time is the Teutonic Order taking Pomerania for themselves, and when they did, as I have mentioned before in my earlier videos, they genocided the local Kashubian population of Gdańsk, and in their place Germans settled there, and in the rest of Teutonic-controlled Pomerania. But alongside the Germans, there were also large amounts of Dutch and Frisian settlers, the Hollanders, which fled from the religious persecution and economic crisis in the Netherlands during the 16th century, and they settled in the sparsely populated, now Polish Royal Prussia, which Poland was quite tolerant religiously, you know. But it is the Hollanders that we have to find for many of Gdańsk's beautiful buildings, architectural designs, which do remind one of Amsterdam or Rotterdam. Though the Northern Germans definitely dominated the region, just because the Northern Germans were in the north, and Pomerania is also in the north, so that makes sense, doesn't it? But there were also some South German settlers, and we must not forget about them. Most notably, they came from Baden-Württemberg or the Palatinate, and it is their cultural influence that brought a popular, to this day, in southern Germany, clothing out game to Pomerania, where it survives as Kaszebszczyn Nutte, probably the most popular cultural text of Kashubia, used today to teach children the language, so it's not forgotten. And also it's sung to tourists in every Kashubian museum and skansen. There is a myth that it's a completely Kashubian concept, but as I mentioned before, it's taken from southern Germany, where it is still alive and played to this day in gatherings and shows, wherein the audience adds new things to the list, be it cultural, political references, or just whatever is funny at the moment. And here it's a super serious cultural artifact that may not be ever changed.
Oh, du schöne, oh, du schöne, oh, du schöne Schweizerland. Ist das nicht ein Kreuz und Quer?
Ja, das ist ein Kreuz und Quer.
Ist das nicht ein Schichtgewehr?
Ja, das ist ein Schichtgewehr.
Schichtgewehr, Kreuz und Quer, hin und her, Kreuz und neu, Schnitzelbank. Oh, du schöne, oh, du schöne.
Łeżni, prostnik, szewik, spójna, widwe, grojny, ryteltyć, łeżny, czy kaszeba, basy, skrzypci, krótci, duzi, to kaszebsku stoleca.
Eventually, pretty much all of Pomerania proper and most of the Pomeranian elite became German. They didn't all speak a unified German language, though. Like today, they didn't even speak a unified Low German language or unified Pomeranian dialect. Let's take them up again. In the west, we've got the Mecklenburg-Vorpommern dialect, which is still spoken today in the Mecklenburg-Vorpommern state of Germany, which, as the name suggests. Furthermore, worth noting that the area around the Oder became Brandenburgish speaking when Brandenburg took over the area. Further east in Hinterpommern, we've got the Eastern Pomeranian dialect, and in Pomerania, we've got the West Prussian dialects. What's interesting is that Gdańsk itself had its own special dialect, and there was also a wider dialect in the Vistula Delta, but Gdańsk itself had a special Danziger German dialect, which is, I think, very cool and interesting. It dropped the N in infinitives. So, for example, to make in most Platt or Northern German dialects would be something like Matteln, while in Danzig people were saying Mortel. Also, a fun fact is that elsewhere in Germany, tobacco, is of the masculine grammatical gender, while in Danziger German it is of the feminine, probably with the influence of Kashubian and the famous Kashubian tobacco, where tabata is also feminine. It also employed diminutive endings to verbs, just like Kashubian does. Staying in Gdańsk, it's worth to mention the Scottish merchants that settled here, giving name to two settlements, which are districts of Gdańsk today, or like places, not official administrative districts. There's Stare Schlotte and there's Nowe Schlotte. In Kashubian it's Stary Scotland and Novi Scotland. Or in English, as you might have guessed, it's Old Scotland and New Scotland. So there's even some Scots. Well, not today because they were deported in 1945, but there used to be. Another thing that separated Pomerania from Western Pomerania historically, apart of course from the former's loyalty to Poland and its Slavic language as opposed to the German West, is religion. Indeed, when the Protestant Reformation came to fruit, Pomerania was under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and remained Catholic, while the Duchy of Pomerania and later Brandenburg Prussia were Protestant. Religion was another thing then that separated Kashubians from the Germanized Pomeranians. Except there remained some Kashubians which became Protestant in the former Duchy of Pomerania, in the area around Weba. They became known as the Slovincians, and their region is Slovincia, and there is the Slovincian National Park there today. There's some really interesting deserts there. Did you know there's deserts in Pomerania? Now you do. Their language is often considered separate from Kashubians, from the Kashubian language, although others claim that it's a dialect of Kashubian, but knowing Kashubian and not knowing Slovincian, but having had some contact with Slovician, I must say that it does make a lot of sense to call it a completely separate language. They were allowed to stay in Poland after the war, but as far as I know, all left for Germany as soon as they could. Many such cases. And now an ethnic group that unfortunately didn't have much of a choice, and if they hadn't fled, were either deported or killed, the Kursenieki, which are basically Latvians who lived on the Vistula Spit. Well, mainly on the Curonian Spit, as the name suggests, but we don't care about the Curonian Spit right now. We care about the Vistula Spit because it's part of Pomerania. And indeed they did live in the Vistula Spit, as far as the coast of Gdańsk, actually, which is really interesting. Now they're basically extinct. Only 219 remained in 1955, and most of them in Latvia, so I don't imagine there's any at all in Pomerania today. Finally, staying sort of on the topic of Baltic peoples, there is quite a mystery at hand here, namely that of whether or not Balts settled west of the Vistula at one point. before the Slavs or even before the Germans did, because there were also Germanic peoples before the Slavic people settled here, but that's another matter. That's before Pomerania became known as Pomerania, so doesn't really concern us today. Maybe I'll do a video on pre-Slavic Pomeranian populations later. There are some notable claims that some of the place names in Pomerania are seemingly of Baltic origin, and Wikipedia lists the Pomeranian Baltic language as one language of the Western Baltic branch. But the only source they have to such a language existing is a very shady Russian website. So I don't think that's a reliable source, and none of the books on Pomeranian prehistory that I own mention the Baltic settlement. While I don't think it's impossible for Pomeranian Balts to have existed beyond individual Prussian settlements which one can assume existed, it's definitely highly speculative, and we shouldn't come to any definite conclusions in this area. But yeah, I hope you learned something new today, and if you are living in Pomerania and are of an ethnic group that I didn't mention, or if you know a significant ethnic group in Pomerania that I didn't mention, or if you just want to share your story, maybe how you came here, what you like about here, or whatever, just leave a comment. It helps me out a lot. I love reading your comments, and I love to hear your story, or the story of whoever you want to talk about in the comments below. So thank you for watching. Bye bye.